My 8th grade teacher had us do a project on some topic in science, and I chose the effect of zinc on the pancreas.
That was in 8th grade?
Yes, but I kept going in with like crazy questions to my teacher, and I was like, well, how do you make nitroglycerin?
You asked that question?
Yes, I did.
For like heart pain.
But you know, it's an explosive.
What?
It is an explosive.
Does every chemist know how to make explosives?
If you're a bad chemist enough, yeah.
Okay.
As a scientist, how do I reconcile my Christian faith with science? And how I view science is trying to figure out God's work.
Hey everyone, I'm Miles, and I'm the voice and lead Bible teacher behind Impact Video Ministries. And welcome to my personal podcast, Practical Christianity, where my goal is to provide practical wisdom for everyday Christians. And the way I do that is by interviewing Christians of different backgrounds so we can see how they follow God, and hopefully we can learn from their experience. And today's episode is titled The Christian Life of a Chemist, and I'll be interviewing my good friend Keo. Keo currently works as a chemist and is about to go back to school to get his doctorate. So since we live in a culture where science and faith seem to be opposing viewpoints, I thought it would be good for us to kind of learn from a Christian who is a scientist at the same time. So let's get started. Okay, Keo. Well, welcome to our very first podcast. You're our very first one.
So that's a lot of pressure for number one.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. But anyways, so why don't you tell everybody just a little bit about you? I'm not a scientist, you know this. Mm-hmm. You tutored me in high school. You also tutored my sister. You also have the ability to just be a substitute teacher for calculus and pre-calculus. So for people like me who don't know too much about science, what kind of chemist are you? Like, what do you do and what do you do for work right now?
Okay, so what kind of chemist am I? My background, like my actual degree, is in chemistry with a specialization in physical chemistry. And physical chemistry is the kind of mixing of physics and chemistry, right? So we're looking at chemistry in a physics kind of world. So things like thermodynamics, things like quantum mechanics, all bind into chemistry, right? So the idea of energy in chemical systems and things like that. So that's what I studied. In terms of what I currently do, though, I am a research associate for a biotech company called Molecular Express, and they do research on vaccines and cancer therapeutics.
Okay.
And so my current job there is to test our formulations to make sure, let's say we make some kind of medication, let's say, for example, right? Mm-hmm. So there's the medication, but there's all these other ingredients that has to go into it. And when we make the medication, it's not 100% that everything gets transferred into the medication, right? Because we have to filter things out, mm-hmm. we have to do certain things. And so in that process, we might lose some, but if we send it out,
like part of the ingredient
list, mm-hmm. if we send it out, and we say, let's say we have 10 micrograms of the compound of interest, right? Mm-hmm. So I need to make sure, what I do is I test to make sure that we have 10 micrograms of that compound.
Yeah.
Right. So if we have more, that's okay. There's a limit of how much more we can go, but I have to be within a range, but we can't go below it. Uh-huh. Right. So like, let's say it takes 10 micrograms a dose mm-hmm. for something to work. If it goes below that, then the medication is ineffective.
Okay.
And so I have to make sure that it's above that. So I basically test all the formulations through a process called high performance liquid chromatography.
High performance
liquid chromatography.
Yeah,
so okay. HPLC for short. So mm-hmm. I'm probably going to be referring to that as HPLC from now on.
Yes, and I will remember what that means.
Right, high performance liquid chromatography for people at home.
Yes.
So basically, it's a machine that separates the compound, the medication into individual compounds, mm-hmm. and it will test for each individual thing, and we can see what's in there and how much of it is in there. Right. So that's my current job.
So I remember, because we used to work as teachers, mm-hmm. and I was the Bible teacher and you were the chemistry teacher. Yeah. And I really thought it was cool that your very first kind of assignment or lab was to have them cook something or to have your students bake something. Mm-hmm. And at first I was like, oh, that's really cool. Like I went to your class and you made me ramen. And I think that might have been a separate thing. But the idea was that you related chemistry to cooking. So it kind of sounds like, as I'm listening to you right now, you have this recipe for all of these vaccines, medications, making sure that all of the right ingredients go into the
The recipe, yeah.
the recipe. Okay. So it is a lot like cooking.
It is. It is. And yeah, a lot of times in my current job, I'm handed pretty much a recipe, and they say follow this, right?
Yeah.
We have all the ingredients. Say 10 milliliters of this, some of this, some of and I weigh it all out and I measure it all out and I put it into a container and I mix it all up. So it's a lot like cooking, pretty much.
So when I think of chemistry, I feel like you just kind of imagine like the vials and stuff and like things like, oh no, it's turning red and then it explodes. Is there anything, because you're working with medicines and you're working with vaccinations that are going into people, just off the top of my head, do you ever work with like dangerous stuff? Like it is absolutely essential that you get the right amount of a certain ingredient. Otherwise there's going to be like really bad ramifications.
Okay. So
have you had any kind of job that kind of made it like, I better get this right?
The chemicals are always dangerous, right? Well, we always go in assuming that the chemicals are always dangerous. Now, there are certain chemicals that I always work with that are very dangerous, especially acids, right? Like sulfuric acid, nitric acid, hydrochloric acid, which if you get it on your skin will burn you, right? Sodium hydroxide, things like that. That's a base that if you get on your skin will eat at your skin.
Yeah.
You might feel it. Sometimes you don't until it's too late. But so in terms of like getting the exact amount, now exact amount for me is, and I think for science, is as long as you're within, maybe 5%, right? So if something is 10 grams, right? I feel like more often than not, you're given a leeway of like 0.5 grams. Now you should try your best, to get within 10, like to get 10 grams.
Yeah, because can you be really exact like all the time?
You cannot be exact all the time. Now there are certain techniques that allows you to be exact, but I think if you are within 5%, 3% usually. But when it comes to like, are there bad ramifications for going over or not? If you're within reasonable amounts, not much will happen, right? And it all comes down to technique. So like actually today, we have an intern who is now who's working there full time, but she comes from a biology background, so not so much chemistry.
Yeah.
So one of the techniques for diluting acids is acid into water, right? And this is one of those things where a lot of people don't know, and why you do that is when you have a very concentrated acid and you pour in some water, it's going to heat up. And
I did not know that.
If you put water into the acid, small amount of water.
Any acid.
Yeah, any concentrated acid.
Okay.
Right? If you put water into any concentrated acid, there's a chance it will boil over because it's getting so hot. Okay. If you do it the other way around, you put the acid into the water, the small amount of acid that goes into the water will heat up, but there's enough water. Usually you want to have enough water to cool it down as you're continually pouring in. And so it won't boil over, but it will get hot. Right? So that's a technique that may have ramifications if you do it the wrong way.
Okay. Wow.
So certain things can happen when you do something the wrong way.
Okay. So question, I'm actually kind of curious about this too. I think you might have answered it in the past, but did you always know that you wanted to be a chemist or a scientist? I know you were always good at math. I know you always just kind of like didn't do your homework because you can just ace the tests and everything in high school. But was science always something that you knew for sure or that you wanted to do?
That goes back to kindergarten, because I distinctly remember being asked, what do we want to do when we grow up? And my best friend at that time, he said he wanted to be a paleontologist because he loves dinosaurs.
Okay.
And I love dinosaurs at that time. Stegosaurus being my favorite dinosaur.
That's the long neck one?
No,
the spiky tail. Got it. Okay, sorry.
Yeah. So Stegosaurus was my favorite dinosaur. And I was like, okay, that sounds cool, but I don't want to copy what he's copying. but I guess that's when I first learned of the word scientist, right? Somebody who's into science. And I think from there, I read a lot of the science book, right? So every time we went to the library, I always picked out a nonfiction book, something maybe about the solar system, something about dinosaurs, something about anything science related, right? And so I think from from kindergarten, I really like the idea of being a scientist. Um, and then right around eighth grade, when I did my first kind of project into chemistry, I think my eighth grade teacher at that time had us do a project on, I believe it was just some topic in science, and I chose I believe it was diabetes and the effect of zinc on the pancreas in order to help produce insulin.
That was in 8th grade?
Yes, but that sounds more, involved than it actually was. But it was just kind of like, here's a general idea of what I think I know about it.
Sure. Did you choose that?
Yeah, I chose that.
Of course you did.
Right. And so I was like, oh, you know what? This is pretty cool. And, I didn't understand half the things I'm reading because it's really in-depth, like chemistry stuff. And I'm an eighth grader.
How did you learn chemistry in 8th grade? I didn't learn chemistry in 8th grade.
It was part of the science.
It was like, general science.
General science.
It was just kind of like thrown in there.
Section, yeah. And then at the end of the year.
You're right. Okay. I do remember learning about atoms.
Yeah.
That's chemistry.
Atoms, yeah. Okay. I think it was like the fun thing we had to do was create words out of the periodic table.
Okay.
So that's what I remember doing. But yeah, I think our end of the year project was pick, a topic, and I chose that. And then I really liked looking into the chemistry of things. And I think even then, towards the end of the year, I kept going in with like crazy questions to my teacher. And, I was like, well, how do you make nitroglycerin? Like, why would you need to learn nitroglycerin?
You asked that question.
Yes, I did.
Nitroglycerin.
Yeah.
For like heart pain.
Yeah, for angina, heart pain.
Oh my goodness.
But it's an explosive.
What?
It is an explosive.
Nitroglycerin is an explosive. Yes. Does every chemist know how to make explosives?
If you're a bad chemist enough, yeah.
Okay.
I think it, comes with it. But then going into like high school, so that's when I decided chemistry. And at that point, I knew that you can either go to like biochemistry.
Yeah.
Which is kind of chemistry and biology mixed together, which is chemistry of life and things like that. And then I didn't know at that time what it was called physical chemistry, but it was just kind of like thermodynamics. And so I just thought, okay, I want to do maybe this way, which is the kinetics and thermodynamics of chemistry.
Yeah.
Or biochemistry. And I really liked the idea of biochemistry at that time. This was probably 10th grade when we took chemistry.
Yeah.
And then when we got into...
So you already knew a lot, because I didn't know this about in your 8th grade year. So when we started our chemistry class, you already had a familiar background with everything that we were learning. Because you were sleeping in a lot of our chemistry class.
Yeah, I mean, it was like surface level. I still need to learn how to do all the
but it had to have come easy to you because you aced every test.
I'm not sure if I aced every test, but yes.
Well, I don't know if a lot of people passed that class.
I guess I was one of the few who passed that class. Yeah. But yeah, I think at that time I did know a fair amount of chemistry to go in to the class.
So from there, I think you took AP chemistry.
I did take AP chemistry.
And then you graduated and you eventually went to UCLA.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's where I went into UCLA for general chemistry.
Okay.
And then I switched into the specialization for physical chemistry, which focuses more. So the general chemistry, you would have taken physical chemistry classes, you would have taken organic chemistry, advanced organic chemistry, inorganic chemistry classes and things like that. But when you do the specialization, you focus more on quantum mechanics and thermodynamics, were the two main things you focused on in your upper division level classes.
Okay. Well, one of the reasons why I wanted you to be one of our very first podcasts is because, for one, I don't know anything about science. And whenever I think of my group of friends, our group of friends, you're the science guy,
Yeah.
And
Kino guy, the science guy.
That's right. Kino guy, the science guy. I feel like when it comes to Christianity, it looks like Christians and their faith and people in their science can a lot of times be at odds.
Mm-hmm.
And you are a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that you're a strong Christian that has influenced me in my walk. So can you talk a little bit about how you started following God?
Mm.
And because we talked about your path as a chemist,
Yeah.
you know, from kindergarten to 8th grade and then to high school and then to UCLA and to where you're working now. Can you kind of paint that picture of what your walk with God, kind of how it started
Yeah.
and how it grew from there?
Mm-hmm. That also happened in my childhood. So
No, really?
Yeah.
I thought there's just a lot I don't know about you.
So when I was younger, I'm going to say 5, so about kindergarten age,
Okay.
there used to be a family. So I lived in, first, let's go back to where I used to live in an apartment complex. It was all Cambodians, 32 units. But there used to be a family who came into this complex who were Christians. And they kind of, I don't know what it was, but they just kind of opened up their kind of doors to the church to, bring people to church and, and all this. So at that time, I think it was kind of for my mom, free daycare, I guess. But I went to church there. That's kind of where I started. I learned we started doing Bible verses, and it was cool because she taught me how to do like Bible verses, and we had to recite it, but we also had to recite it in sign language also.
So you know a little bit of sign language.
I don't remember much anymore, but yeah, that's what we used to have to do. And then even at that time, I was part of the choir too, and so we sang, and so I think that's kind of the foundation. And I think they were there until pretty much my middle school years, and that's kind of where I went on Sundays till my middle school years, and that's kind of how I grew. As I wasn't sure if I was a full Christian yet. It's kind of a weird era in my life, but I do remember that. So they did move to Louisiana, and I was kind of in a weird phase of what do I do now?
Yeah.
Every Sunday was always church. And I didn't, my family weren't Christians. So I didn't know how to reconnect to a church. I didn't, I didn't know where to go.
Yeah.
And there were like times where, Jehovah's Witnesses would come around, and I would thought, oh, no, it's a church. So I would go there and try it out.
Yeah.
Didn't feel right, and it wasn't until, so that's probably 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade. And then I think it was until like late high school when you're like, hey, let's go to Costa Mesa, Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa. I was like, oh, that's right. I used to go to church. Well, let's go back to church. And I think that's when I reconnected.
Yeah.
And I think I was brought back to God at that point. I was kind of young. The environment I was in wasn't really Christian-like.
Yeah.
Just because, the background wasn't really Christian. And so now I had you to pull me back into the path of Christianity that was there on Monday nights.
Yeah.
And then we started, going to CCPC, and it just kind of went on from there onward. So I think that's kind of the foundation. Yeah. In me becoming the Christian.
So how does your walk with God and how does Christianity affect you as a scientist, as a chemist? How do you hold those two together, when it comes to work and everything?
Well, for work is work. It's kind of like following a recipe every day, right? But as a scientist, how do I reconcile my Christian faith with science? And, I think at the end of the day, how I view science is pretty much trying to figure out God's work. God created everything for us. And I think in my mind, the math and the science behind it is really just kind of a way of God showing us, this is how it works. Yeah. It's hard to describe it in language, so he has to describe it in numbers. I think numbers are kind of universal in that sense.
Yeah.
right? Two is two in every language. You might have a different word for it, but two is two. And so I think it's easier when God shows us in numbers what he's doing, because it's universal in that sense.
Yeah.
Everybody in the world can understand what that means. So I think in terms of science, it's really just me trying to understand what God's doing in a physical sense in this world. So I think that's how I reconcile my Christian faith with science.
I really like that answer. That's a fun answer. Huh. Two is two in every language, or not in every language, but
It has the same meaning in every language.
yes.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
You know,
And numbers are universal.
yeah, numbers are universal.
So I'm sure going to UCLA, I'm sure just kind of growing up in the science community, there's probably a lot of people who either don't believe in God or are against God. So how are those interactions? Like, have you ever been able to kind of like share your faith, or have you ever been able to like have good conversations? Like, what does it look like when you talk to people who are antagonistic against God?
Interestingly, I haven't run into a lot of people who are antagonistic to like the Christian faith. It's, usually when I tell them I'm Christian, it's usually just, oh, okay.
Yeah.
And that's the end of the story for them. But I think if I try to have a conversation, it just ends up being science, a debate in science.
Yeah.
Like, well, this proves this, but they have these counter arguments. But I think, especially at UCLA, maybe it was just where I was specifically in the dorms, but like I had one of my good friends there. He was Christian, and he was a biochemistry major, which is why I actually became his friend in the first place. I was like, oh, somebody else is a chemistry major. And I found out later he was a Christian. But then they have, Christian groups that I joined into.
Yeah.
And, then I started realizing a lot of them are also science majors and things like that. So maybe I was just in an environment that was more open towards, Christian scientists at that point. But also, I do remember a few of my professors being Christians also in chemistry.
Really?
Yeah.
In chemistry, your chemistry professors.
Yeah. So I do remember one of my professors in like the lower division classes. He brought up his schedule because he was trying to show us how to be time management. This is like lower division. You're first starting out in college, how to time manage. And then, he's going through his schedule. He's going through it, and I see, he has Bible studies on Wednesdays, It said Mark chapter 1. And I was like, wow, that was the first time I thought, well, maybe you could look into the Bible for answers in science too.
Yeah.
That was I actually even so Rebecca, when she was taking organic chemistry, I actually taught her that verse too to help her remember the rule in chemistry.
Do you remember the rule?
Okay, so the rule is called Zaitsev's rule, and I just only
Zaitsev's rule.
Zaitsev's rule.
Okay.
Or I believe it's anti-Zaitsev's rule.
Okay.
But it's basically I believe so. I think I should base it off of the verse, which was in Luke about spiritual gifts, where I think it's like, take from he who has more, he who has less, and give to he who has more.
Like the talents, you mean?
Yeah, the talents.
Oh, okay, the talents.
And so in organic chemistry, when you do something called a reduction, it's counterintuitive, right? When you think this molecule, this part of the molecule has a lot. Why should I not take from this part of the molecule, right?
Okay.
Because it has a lot already. So it's counterintuitive. And so I was taught that verse, whereas, well, you actually have to take from the lesser one and give to the one that has more.
So this isn't a mnemonic or anything like play on words. It's like conceptual. Like this is what happened in the talent in this passage. So in the exact same way that it happens in this passage, it happens in this law?
In this rule, yeah.
In this rule.
So, I think it's actually not a reduction. It's the opposite of a reduction. A reduction is to make a double bond. In this case, it's what happens is you break the double bond, right? So if one side has two hydrogens, one side has one, you always give to the side that has more hydrogen, right? So that's where you're like, oh, it doesn't really make sense to do that.
Yeah.
It already has enough. Why give it more?
Uh-huh.
So that was like the first time I ever heard a Bible verse, the concept of a Bible verse being taught
Yeah.
in the
At
concept
the
of it.
university level,
Yeah.
just using this Bible verse to
Mhm.
teach chemistry.
Yeah.
That's really
So,
cool.
so again, I think it was just the environment I was in already
Mm-hmm.
makes, I don't think I've encountered too much of and antagonistic views towards
Yeah.
Christianity. But I think it was more questions, and I think it's not from my peers, but at the time when I was tutoring, there was a student who I was tutoring who went through a lot. She was going through a lot emotionally.
Mm-hmm.
And at this time she was questioning life and, high school years. She's questioning life and what should she believe? And I think at that point, I asked her like, well, what do you believe? And it came down. She's like, I really don't know. And I want to say there's a God. I don't know there's a God. And, I kind of walked her through the idea of, well, let's see what happens if there is a God. What does that look like? What does that look like emotionally for a person? What does that look like logically, in the world
Yeah.
and things like that? And it just kind of walked her through it, and it helped her a lot, I think. And I think having that background of kind of science and my faith and religion, I think that helped open her up to the possibility. And I think it
Yeah.
solidified the idea,
Hmm.
and I think it eventually kind of simmered down for her what she was going through, her anxieties,
Yeah.
So I think it's more, I don't think I felt the antagonistic views,
Mm-hmm.
but I think there are people who are questioning it,
Mm-hmm.
And they just sometimes don't care,
Mm-hmm.
right? Especially in science, they're in their sciences, they don't care, and then there are others who are open.
So on our other YouTube channel, Impact Video Ministries, I get a lot of comments, a lot of negative comments that say, can't see God, you guys believe in fairy tales. And one of the things that I really kind of want to hear from you is like, as a scientist, how would you respond to someone who says, I'll believe it when I can see it, or in other words, like, as a scientist, what is your argument? One argument that you have that there is a God, maybe an argument, but even just reason, like, why are you a Christian? And what, in your perspective, as someone who has studied the sciences, who understands the scientific method, who understands the observation steps, and then you create a hypothesis and everything, like, from your background, what would you say is a good reason why someone should believe in God?
As a scientist, this is as a scientist and not as me as a person, I guess, but as a scientist, I think when you look at the world, there's so much that it provides for us,
Mm-hmm.
that science can't explain or is trying to explain. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Science is always trying to, discover new things and explain new things. But these are things that were always here for us, right? And we're just learning about them now. So if they're already here, and I think more and more we learn that they're here for us, like, what's known as the Goldilocks region for a planet,
Mm-hmm.
you know, uh, where habitable life can exist. That's, I can say, I probably could say it's rare. We do find other planets out there that are in the Goldilocks region, but that's just kind of the distance it has to be away from the sun,
The Earth.
the
Yeah.
Earth,
Mm-hmm.
the size of the Earth, and what's on it and things like that. So things can fit into, let's say, the distance away from their star and maybe their size, but Earth in particular is almost perfect in that sense. I actually just learned that there's a ratio for this. I forgot what the actual ratio is called, but we are actually 0.82 on the ratio for like the Goldilocks region.
Mm-hmm.
There are other planets that are actually a bit higher
Mm-hmm.
in those regions. So technically more supposed to be more habitable than us,
Okay.
than Earth, and yet we haven't detected any radio signals or life on those planets. So
Right.
even though we're lower than other
We
planets,
have
we have
life.
life here,
So how do we know it's more habitable when we are
right?
habitable?
So we are living here on
Yes.
Earth currently. So you look at everything, it's hard to say that this is a random chance of things.
Mhm.
Now, it could be a random chance of things, but the chances of that ever happening are infinitesimally low, I think,
Yeah.
for all these events to line up. And as you know, I also taught stats, AP stats.
Yeah.
And you know, when you look at all the independent events that had to occur
Mm-hmm.
for us to get here, it becomes very, very, very small chance these things happen. So I think as a scientist, how I would, say God exists is just be in the moment of where you are. And I think you'll realize the exact moment of where you are, time and place is just God's presence there.
Hmm.
But that's, I guess, me more as a person now saying that. But to say an argument for God, there's so many that I would, list just as a scientist, things like the fine tuning,
Yeah.
um,
I remember asking you about that.
mhm.
I called you because I had to teach a theology class and we were talking about I forgot exactly which attribute I think I was talking about. I think it might have been omniscient. No, not omniscience. I think it was omnipotence, just the power to do anything and to be able to create the human body.
Yeah.
All of the different systems of, the digestive system, the nervous system, the reproductive system, all the systems. But then I remember asking you and calling you like, hey, when it comes to the universe, can you explain to me a little bit about the fine tuning of life? And you were
Yeah.
talking to me about constants.
Yeah.
How there's all these different constants, like there's heat constants, water
Yeah.
constants.
What specific heat constants for water? Yeah.
Yeah. And so you have all of these constants. Can you name them again? And because like all these constants need to be constant in order for life to be
Yeah.
sustainable.
I mean, the biggest one, I like to go through, and I felt like this might be me exaggerating the time frame, but I do remember a whole section in chemistry just about water, right? And its ability and the specific heat of water, right? It turns out water holds a lot of heat, and this is a good thing for us because that means it doesn't, evaporate as easily as certain things,
Mhm.
and it also keeps temperatures pretty mild because it's holding on to a lot of heat. And then when it gets hot and when it gets cooler, it's releasing some of that heat. So, you see this actually in like coastal regions around the world where the temperatures are very mild. That's because of the waters. The water's holding onto the heat during the day, and at night it's releasing that heat. And so, it doesn't get too hot or too cold. And places where you don't have a lot of water, like the deserts and things like that, arid regions, you see big temperature swings, right? Daytimes can be really hot and night times can be really cold. That's because there's not a lot of water there to regulate that. So having water, having its specific heat where it is very crucial for life on Earth,
Yeah.
right? So one, it doesn't evaporate as much. Two, its freezing point, right? It doesn't freeze as well as other things, I should say. It takes a while. There are things that actually freeze way less than water, which is actually a good thing. So the temperature at which water freezes and how it freezes. So water is one of 2 or 3 compounds on Earth where its solid form is less dense than its liquid form, right? So most things, when you turn it into a solid, it will sink, right? In its, so I think mercury is the other one. But water, because it floats, is actually something almost miraculous if you think about it. So if ice were to sink, right? This is what would happen as it gets colder. The ice, if it sinks, will drop to the bottom. Now down here, we do know cold water is actually less dense, right? So it actually will stay down here. So as it freezes, it's going to freeze from the bottom up, right? And what's going to happen there if it freezes from the bottom up? Well, the whole thing's, you pretty much have a giant frozen lake or,
Yeah.
things like that. A glacier is pretty much a column of frozen water. Now imagine all the living things living in there, right? And they have to survive that. Most things can't survive that.
Mm-hmm.
However, while cold water is denser, right? As it freezes, it'll start to rise to the top, and it'll actually freeze at the top. And what this does is actually insulates the water. So a lot of lakes will actually have a frozen layer on top, but fish can still exist on the bottom.
Yeah.
Because it's actually insulated from the cold air on top because of the ice.
Got it.
And that's because it freezes above the water.
So if water did not do that, then everything that is alive in that water, all of that food source would just be gone.
Gone. Yeah.
So.
And that's just water freezing.
Yeah.
Right? It's almost a miracle that water does that. And like I said, it's one of the very few compounds on Earth where its solid form is less dense than its liquid form.
Okay. So I'm glad that you said miracle, because that goes into our next question. And what is your perspective, or what are your thoughts on Jesus's miracles? Because Jesus, when he performed these miracles, he defied natural laws.
Yes.
And a lot of people would talk about the Bible and like, wow, you really believe in like Jesus multiplying bread and Jonah being eaten up by a fish? And like, how does your mind reconcile the fact that these are impossible things that are against science, but you're also a Christian and you believe these things? So how do you think, like, yeah, this is a cool thing of water, like that miracle, but how do you reconcile that with miracles as read in the Bible?
Yeah. So for miracles as read in the Bibles, I think you really have to, at this point, believe that Jesus was divine, right? God lives outside of our realms. And so how I reconcile that is in that sense where God can manipulate, what he needs to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this, it's not that, I guess, mysterious for me in a sense. A lot of things in science comes up where it's just like, I guess that's what it is, right? We can measure these things and we're like, well, I guess that's what it is. Things like, what is it? Quantum tunneling, right? So an electron,
tunnel. Okay. What is quantum tunneling?
It's the idea an electron really can just kind of appear. So it can just be here and in the next moment somewhere else. Now that's probably because it's moving faster than we can perceive it, or at least measure it.
Yeah.
But at one moment it's here, the next moment it's somewhere else.
Yeah.
Quantum entanglement is the biggest thing right now. And quantum entanglement says two particles who are related in some way are entangled. And so what happens to one thing causes the other thing to change, right?
Okay.
So when they're next to each other, we're like, okay, that makes sense. If think of magnets, right? If I put them next to each other, they're going to stick, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So, and then if I flip it, it's going to push the other one away, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, what happens to magnets when I move them further away? Let's say far enough away where they don't stick, right? If I just put them here, they're not going to, unless they're very powerful magnets, right?
Yes.
But if, let's say they're small magnets, I put them here, nothing's going to happen. Now, quantum entanglement says, well, if I spread them this far apart, they'll still send information like they'll stick to each other, something like that. And it can happen regardless of kind of the distance between them. Now, that means that information is moving faster than the speed of light. And I think Einstein's relativity says nothing moves faster than the speed of light. Speed of light is constant. And so quantum entanglement right now, I think, is the biggest kind of mystery. We know it. We've observed it happening. Right? And it's just kind of one of the things like, okay, well, let's try to figure it out. But it is what it is right now.
Got it. So you are saying that miracles is almost no problem to you, even though you don't understand it. because there are these miracles that you see in science, like quantum entanglement, that you're like, well, I don't understand it. We see it, but it's a big, huge question mark in the science, in the community of science. So it's kind of like, well, you just don't know it.
Yeah.
And same thing with God. Like you just don't know.
Exactly. And I think the miracles he does is for his purposes on what he needs to do here, right? So feeding the multitude, obviously, it's what he needed to do at that time.
Yes.
So if we were to question it, I think it's kind of like God just had to do what he had to do,
Yeah.
right? I think at one point it's kind of God needs to show himself on certain things. And that's probably what a miracle, in my sense, would be. God just needs to show himself to clear up anything.
I really like that. Quantum entanglement.
Yeah. There's lots of things in science. I think that, and that's the beauty of science right now is, there's so much to discover. There's so much to learn, things like that. It's a never ending quest.
So what are your thoughts on the creation of the world? So there are a lot of evolutionists, and I know there's some Christians who believe in some kind of form of evolution, but what are your thoughts on the creation story? Do you think that God created everything in 6 literal days? Do you think he created the earth with age? Do you think that God did use evolution? There's some Christians who believe that evolution did happen and we did come from goop and we evolved and God was just in control of that whole thing. So what are your thoughts on evolution? Because I feel like a lot of scientists just like, it's evolution, and it's fact, So what are your thoughts on that?
So I think everyday life, we can see small amounts of evolution happening, right? And I think there are studies that show minor evolutions happening here and there. To go back to, say, the primordial sea with all of this, nucleic acid or amino acids and all these chemicals lying around in this sea of life, that it just so happens to randomly combine and create something. I think for me, that's harder to believe than saying that these were building blocks that somebody put together in a very specific way. Right? So I will say the creation part in that sense makes more sense.
Yeah.
I don't think I've read anything that has shown that if you put a bunch of the necessary chemicals needed, like for our DNA and our amino acids, if you just let them sit there, I don't think they've come together enough to form life.
Yeah.
Now the process may have taken, as what people think, millions of years to do.
Yeah.
But, that moves away from the idea of evolution in the sense that, well, the species that evolved, I guess, had to know or had to have some kind of external factor.
Yeah.
But in terms of the DNA and things like that, what's the environment pushing it to change into something else, right?
Okay.
So I think when we talk about the creation of animals and humans, I think it's easier. I think it's more defined when you think of building blocks and somebody building it.
Yeah.
Than to say it was, happenstance, just things coming together.
I can see how your chemistry background kind of affected your view on creation, because as a chemist, you build things.
Yeah.
You have all of the rest. You have the recipe. You have all of the ingredients. You have, the building blocks of the thing that you need to make. And it takes your mind to be able to create something very, very complex.
Yeah.
And in the same way, it makes more sense for God to see the recipe and being humanity in the world, that everything is needed for it to all function, and for him to just put it all together. That makes more sense to you.
And then when it comes to like my, small evolutionary changes, I think that's true. Now that we have these species and things like that need to survive and adapt to its environment, now that part makes sense.
Yeah.
And in a sense, can we not say that God is also having a hand in this, where he's creating these environments for these species to kind of take over or not, and
Yeah.
things like that. I still think God will have a hand in that, and even though it's minor evolutionary changes like changing colors, right? So butterflies that are more gray versus brown, right? So I think the big one, I think that's one of the first things they put in a lot of textbooks is I forgot what kind of butterflies they are, but when the Industrial Revolution happened, a lot of ash was being put out into the air and it would land on trees. Now trees look more silver than they do brown, or grayish, ashy gray than they do brown. So then the ashy gray butterflies are now surviving more.
Okay.
Right. And
yeah,
that right there makes sense in terms of an environment leading to a change. Right.
yeah,
But to say like that butterfly came from the ocean, through that process over and over. Well, what environment led to, the egg or the larva, and what environment, like there's nothing in this ocean to push in that direction.
I just feel like I'm learning so much about science right now because I don't learn at all about science. I just kind of, I don't want to just say I just read the Bible or self-help books, but in your field, is there anything in your research? Because it looks like you read a lot of things. You're reading things about like the planets and certain discoveries and quantum entanglement. Is there anything in all of your reading and all of your research that made you go deeper in your faith?
Yeah. So I think I wanted to bring this up. You know how I was saying my professor used the Bible verse to kind of teach. I think what I really wanted to reconcile for me was, Jesus being fully man and fully God, right? Being two things at the same time, right? And I think when I looked into this idea, and when I learned in the quantum chemistry classes was, when the first thing you learn is light, right? It's all about light. And a lot of the times light in quantum chemistry, or at least quantum mechanics, is light and it's dual nature personality.
Okay.
Right. So light, right. Well, let's split things up. Okay. So things are a particle, and a particle is kind of a physical thing. Think of a ball, right?
Good. Particle ball.
Right. It has a mass. You can think of it as a mass, and it interacts with other things. Like I can throw it, it has velocity and things like that.
And that's a particle.
You can think of that as a particle, right?
Okay.
Having a mass. And then the other side of that is a wave. Wave is more, think of like an energy. Think of like waves at the ocean, right? It's a movement through a medium, right? Some kind of energy or radiation, I guess, right?
Okay.
So a lot of times, especially in early science, people thought those two things were separate. If you were a particle, you can't be a wave.
Okay.
Right? Because a particle is a thing. They think particle is a thing.
Yes.
Right? A wave is more of ethereal thing. It's kind of permeates.
What is it's more of a movement, right?
And so if you're a wave, you shouldn't act like a particle. And if you're a particle, you shouldn't act like a wave.
Okay.
Right? And you could do this if you throw, a pebble into water, right? The pebble interacts with the water, but the energy creates these waves that radiates, right?
Okay. So you have the particle being thrown into water, and that action creates the waves. So they are two separate things.
Yes. Now, light acts as both, which, the most, I think, I would say the most stark discovery from an experiment would be what's known as the double slit experiment.
The double slit
experiment, right? So they pretty much made these two slits very small, right? And obviously, if you put a wave, if you hit, create a wave and it goes through these things, it will create these concentric waves, right? And then there will be sections where they deconstruct, they work against each other, and there'll be
Okay.
sections that will be constructive. They will build off of each other, right? So you'll see like bigger waves and then goes down, right? So there'll be parts where it's bigger and parts where that's
The light.
the way. Just think about water right now, right?
Okay.
Especially if you're in water and you create two ripples next to each other,
Okay.
right? And when the ripples intersect, you'll see parts that are up and parts that are down, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Right. So that's where it's constructive and that's where it's destructive, right?
Okay.
So they either work against each other or work with each other, right? So we expect that, right? For things that act as a wave.
Mm-hmm.
And then for things that act as a particle, let's say I just threw a bunch of balls
Yeah.
into these two slits. What I would expect is two lines, right, of the balls passing through,
Okay.
right? So where the balls go, I should just see that's where they are, right?
Okay. So the idea of this slit experiment is there's two openings.
Yeah, two openings.
And when a wave
Hits
the opening, people should expect things going up and things going down.
And
constructing and destructing, as what you're saying.
Pattern let's say if it's you'll see the pattern at the wall. Let's say there's a wall, right? And you'll see parts where there's a big wave and there's no wave. Big wave, no wave. So big wave, no wave. So you'll see a wave, no wave, wave, no wave, wave, no wave.
Okay. That's
right?
what they would see with
That's what
the wave.
with a wave. Now, let's say we just sprayed,
the particles,
right?
Okay.
So let's just think about if I did like a hairspray or something, right? And I sprayed it through the slit.
It would just go through.
You'll just have one line of where that slit is if it's a particle.
Yes.
Right? So that's what they expected. What happened was, okay, so now we can shoot one electron out, right? And one electron goes, it might hit a wall, it might not. It might go through the slit. Okay. So if it's a particle, I would see two areas where it hits. But what happened is you actually start to see a wave pattern, even though you know that you shot an electron, which is thought to be a particle.
Okay.
Right?
The electron from the light?
Yeah, electron from light.
Got it. Okay. So the electrons are the light in this case. Okay. So they shoot light here. And because they've viewed it as a particle,
it should have.
Just
we know that it's a particle. It should just go to the slit and you should only see two lines.
So we understand light as particles.
And waves, both at the same time.
I always just thought it was a wave.
Right? Yeah, light does work as a wave too. It works as both, which is why it's one of those miracle things that you are just, it is what it is, right? Each packet, so this is where quantum chemistry comes in, because each photon, which is a packet of light, right, actually has some wave in it. So it's a package with waves in it. So it acts as a wave, but it's also a particle.
So you're connecting it to the biblical truth of Jesus being both God and man.
Yep.
Where in John 1:1 it says, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. And then later on, and I think verse 14, where it says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. So this Word that is both God and man, you see this truth that one being can be both things in light. And in the same way that Jesus can be both God and man, light is both particle and waves.
And I think that realization was the most solidifying view for like my Christian faith, because it's kind of one of those things. It's in science. It's one of those things in science where you have to accept it for what it is. We have the data for it. We use it in everyday life. And yet it's one of those things that's almost miraculous, to say the least.
Wow. I am learning a lot right now. Quantum entanglement. And then what was this light one?
Yeah, duality of light.
Duality of light.
Yeah.
So that's something that strengthened your faith. Is there anything in science that like challenged your faith, that made you go like, I don't know?
It always goes back to, I guess, like evolution. I think is the biggest one, because I always, or at least, the old Earth versus new Earth kind of ideal. I think that's the biggest thing that challenges me, mainly because we have data, but I feel like the data is not conclusive enough for me.
Okay. Data for an old Earth?
Yeah. Like, I guess we can talk about, let's say in the chemistry world, like carbon dating.
Yeah.
Things like that, radioactive carbon.
How reliable is carbon dating? Because I hear a lot about carbon dating, and I hear things like, oh, this is rated at 1 billion million years. And I'm just like, can we trust that? We've only been around, like recorded history has only been around for a few thousand years. So can we really trust something that we just made to be able to accurately say that something was millions of years old? Like, what are your thoughts on carbon dating?
This is where I guess it's more extrapolation than interpolation.
What does that mean?
So extrapolation is, okay, we have this data, right? That from this range, right? Let's say we have a data range. We know what happens in this data range, right? We know what, let's say if I were to try to predict something within this line, right? Interpolation would be like, okay, I know what happens in this line. So I can predict whatever happens within that range.
Okay.
Extrapolation is, well, now I'm going outside of what I know.
Okay.
Right? I'm assuming the data continues that pattern or a pattern.
Uh-huh.
And under that assumption, this is what I predict. Okay, so I think that's extrapolation versus interpolation. So when it comes to like carbon dating, it's looking at the radioactive carbon C14 and how much is there. And we know the half-life of C14. I think you make the assumption of how much C14 was there to begin with, right? And I think that's where the extrapolation comes. You're thinking, okay, well, if this is the pattern for C14, then if this is the data I have for how much, then if we backtrack it, we're going to get millions of years.
Okay.
And, scientifically, mathematically, that makes sense. But I think we're relying too much on extrapolation on that. I haven't really looked into carbon 14 dating, C14 dating. But I know that's the biggest thing to date things around that time. And I think we can carbon date things, into like pre-civilization or into like early civilization era, and I think it's accurate enough where we have some kind of written record at that time and we know this. And so we can coincide those two.
Yeah.
But I think if we go further where there's no written record, it's kind of like, well, what else are we looking at? What other data are we looking at for that?
Do you think anything can like affect the carbon? Like, do you think the surrounding habitat, the
carbon should stay carbon in a sense?
Okay.
Right. So whether it becomes, and I think that probably might contradict what I just said, but if we're only looking at carbon, right? So let's say there's carbon in sugar, right? There's carbon in trees. Now, when the tree dies, and becomes fossilized or become a fossil fuel, whatever carbon was there should stay there. Should stay there. Now, we could lose some to other environmental things.
Fire,
right? The fire might have spread the carbon, right? So the whatever carbon was there might not be completely there. So now what I say, when we assume how much there was originally in carbon 14, I think, I don't know if they have to assume the mass, the total mass of the object, right? In order to see how much there was. But I think the testing for carbon 14, I think we do kind of move outside the data range.
Right.
So I do believe it's reliable in the sense that we could use it it has shown to test for things, right? To use it for like dating things. I think even then, I think some people say there's a range or an error to it. But they say it's pretty accurate to what they believe. So
Okay. So the age of the earth is something that makes you go, I'm not
sometimes,
100% sure.
yeah.
So I actually have a question for you. So when it comes to my belief on the age of the earth, because I know some people who are just like, the earth was made in 6 literal days. And I believe in the earth being made in 6 literal days. I know a lot of people, or a lot of Christians may not. But the way that what I believe is that, and tell me what you think about this belief and whether or not you agree with it or if you think something else. But I think that the earth was created with age. And the reason why I say that is because when Adam and Eve were created, they were created presumably as adults because they were able to, like, shortly after the fall, we don't know exactly how long it was, but, you know, they ended up having like Cain and Abel pretty soon, you know? And so if they were old and mature enough to procreate, then Adam and Eve could possibly only be like 2 years old from the date that they were created, but they looked like they were in their 30s or possibly 40s or whatever. So they might have only been 5, but they were able to have kids. They looked 30. So in the same way, I'm thinking, okay, there's a lot of things in this earth that make it look like it's millions of years old. But when God initially created everything, he created it with age, like he created Adam and Eve with age. So that's how I kind of think of the earth being created. What are your thoughts on that view? Do you think it stands, holds, or do you have another view or another opinion?
You know, that makes sense. I actually didn't think about it that way.
No?
In a sense that, well, yeah, God could have just made it with age. It's not outside of his possibilities.
Right.
Right? If we were to try and reconcile that with what we have now, in our limited knowledge of time, you know, when we have to reconcile, okay, well then, you know, fossils and records of asteroids hitting the planets and things like that, it could have all been manufactured, I guess, to a sense. But at the end of the day, even if you look at the other way of it actually happening, it's also manufactured.
Yeah.
You know, it's something God also probably had a hand in.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I like that idea. But I think for me, at the end of the day, when it comes to stuff like that, I have to step back and think, you know, really remind myself, like, what is most important for me as a Christian? Is it really for me to prove that when, you know, I have this one thing that's kind of swaying me this other way, but I have 10 other things pushing me the other direction. So, you know, at the end of the day, it's like, okay, maybe I'll just put it on the back burner. We'll revisit this as I look into it more and things like that. But I really try not to let it sway me because I have, you know, a bunch of other things for the proof
that solidify your faith.
Mm-hmm.
So when it comes to your walk with God, what are some things that, in the same way with you being a chemist, I feel like a lot of things kind of made you into the scientist that you are today, from your, you know, thoughts back in kindergarten to 8th grade to high school to your college and hearing about these professors, reading all these articles, your work right now. What would you say are, in the same way that you had a lot of components that built you as a scientist, what would you say are the components that helped strengthen your faith? Like, what made you stronger as a Christian?
First and foremost, I think it's prayer for me. So prayer. The other thing is kind of environment, you know, people you're around, and the environment you create for yourself, right? So it's just, that's the friends you make and also the mindset and the environment, you know, external environment you make, right? And that's kind of like devotionals, reading Bible, you know, And I think the biggest one though is prayer for me.
Yeah.
And that's, a lot of times when I get ideas and, just restless nights, just thoughts coming in and out,
Mm-hmm.
I just have a moment. I sit there. It's more like a just talking to God. If it comes to anxiety stuff like that too, I just have a moment. Talk is have a conversation with God,
Mm.
and then at the end of it, I just relinquish it all. It's not my will, it's your will,
Mm-hmm.
and I just have to remind myself not to trust in me, myself in
Mm-hmm.
this world, but to trust in God.
Yeah.
I think that has gotten me through more days than I can count. Is just the ability to pray, to have a moment with God. You know, that's the real foundation for me.
What are some, I feel like when it comes to prayer, I heard a quote that when it comes to the Bible, there's a class for learning the Bible. When it comes to theology, there's a class on theology. There's a bunch of topics in terms of Christianity, apologetics, evangelism. Someone can teach you all those things.
Mm-hmm.
But when it comes to prayer, it's really only learned from God
Yeah.
through your own personal prayer life,
Mm-hmm.
because that's your relationship. So for people who want to, who want to go deeper in their prayer, I kind of want to know, like, okay, what does you say conversation? Can we
Yeah.
unpackage that a little bit more? What does
Ooh.
prayer look like for you?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what are your thoughts? What's going on in your mind? What are your feelings? If you were to break things down in like the scientific method,
Yeah.
do you have like a scientific method-esque, or even just ingredients, that kind of go into your prayer? Like, okay, this is what
Yeah.
I do. Can you paint that for me?
I guess it's the situation, but a lot of times I think how I started off is reminding myself of everything I should be thankful for. I think that's my first thing, right? And then that actually helps me, and I guess in a meditative sense too. So when I'm winding down the day, I have all these thoughts. It's just nice to just stop and thank God for everything,
Yeah.
even the small things. Just getting through the day, making it back home safe, just anything. And that really just helps me remind myself that I am now in the presence with God, right? Just to be thankful. I think that's where I like to start. Then from there, I think I get into this is where the conversation happens.
Mm-hmm.
Because after that, it's like, okay, I was thankful for this, but and it's like, the but is me. It's like, but it would have been nice if this happened, if that, all this, and like, I didn't like how this happened.
Uh-huh.
Why did that happen? What is going on here? Well, what's gonna happen there? And, because as of right now, it's the anxiety about starting school again.
Yeah.
What's gonna happen there? What's gonna happen there? How am I gonna work this out? How am I gonna work that out? You know, then so thereafter I'm like, so then it just comes out kind of like a venting phase for me, where I'm just kind of unleashing what I feel
Yeah.
from the day, whatever pressures I've had, whatever anxieties I've had, I just release it. And I think towards the middle of it, I feel guilty because I'm just like, what's going on?
Yeah.
Why is that? Why is that? Why am I feeling like this? But then I think towards the end of it, after I've kind of let all those pressures go, I think I've come to a realization. That's when I come to a realization at the end of it is like, that's right. I'm a vessel for God's purpose. I don't know why this happened for me, but I just have to trust God at the end of the day, right? That, this, whatever section of my life that was kind of jumbled up or
Yeah.
things like that, well, I got through it with the help of God.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't like it at that time, but I think I'm in a better place now because of it, usually,
Yeah.
you know? And so I think it's a conversation of, let me put myself in the presence of God
Mm-hmm.
by being thankful. That's my first thing. Let me vent a little bit because that's me being human.
Yeah.
And then let me sum it up by reminding myself that at the end of the day, it's God's will and I have to trust God. And I think that's, for me, that's how I feel like I've gotten through so many things in my life. It helped me slow myself down just to be thankful for things,
Yeah.
you know? And then letting me vent actually helps me unload
Yeah.
where I felt.
I think that's important to vent
Mm-hmm.
because I think for me, a lot of times it gets a little pent up
Yeah.
in my mind. And whenever I am able to talk with a friend and say,
Mm-hmm.
this is exactly how I feel, and I think it's stupid and I don't like where I'm at right now,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes just saying that out loud just already helps the healing process.
Yeah.
And I like how you kind of just, as soon as you're done kind of venting, you said you feel guilty, that does happen,
Yeah.
because then it kind of puts things into perspective. And at the same time, I like how you just kind of, it goes back to God.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, you're thankful, you kind of have this journey again, and then you give it back to God and it just kind of brings it back,
Mm-hmm.
to God.
Yeah. And I think that's my kind of recipe, I guess,
Yeah.
for prayer. And that's, through my darkest times, that really got me through.
I'm really glad.
Yeah.
What word, next question, as we kind of start wrapping things up. I think your story and just your background is it's almost relieving.
Mm.
There's certain things that I read in my Bible where I'm like God is good. Things are okay.
Mm-hmm.
There is a God. And just hearing you, who is a scientist, who is okay, I think that's really cool. I was just teaching yesterday on Romans, and we were talking about like predestination, God's sovereignty. God can do whatever he wants, and man's responsibility. So if God is all knowing, then do we really have a choice?
Mm-hmm.
And part of my answer is we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Like, yes, like I know that God can do whatever he wants and he chooses. At the same time, like people do have a choice. Otherwise, why would God try so hard to affect our choice through his word? And I love the fact that you're okay with the unknown because you see it all the time in your profession.
Yeah.
And all of science really is just trying to uncover the unknown.
Mm-hmm.
So for people who are aspiring scientists, for people who, because I don't know, is engineering science?
Yeah,
Okay, so
yeah.
I know a lot of Christians who want to be engineers, who want to be scientists. So like, what word of encouragement would you give to them from someone with your background?
Mm-hmm.
What would you say?
Question everything. I think that comes from the science background, but I think that applies in a Christian sense too. The reason why I came up with the idea for the duality of light was I questioned it. And for me, it made me a stronger Christian in that because I guess at the end of the day, I proved it to myself. Now, not a lot of people need that proof, but I think even in science, don't be afraid to let the ideas clash. Sometimes they don't mend, sometimes, at most of the times, they do. And I think if you're afraid to follow that line and maybe even step over it where, you let the ideas clash and you don't question it, you're going to fall one way or the other. Right? And I think if you do question it and you come up with an answer, and I think both in science and both in Christianity, you will start to see a lot of things melding together. So I would say, don't be afraid to do that. Question it I think it would, especially if you do it wholeheartedly,
Yeah.
it would actually strengthen you as a Christian. That's what I've done my entire life, and it's where I've brought up these ideas to myself. It actually happens a lot during prayer, where I think, well, how can this be? And at the end of the day, it's just like, okay, well, God, show me the way. What information do you want me to see, and what information should I be looking at? And there it is. Most of the time it comes up. And I think when you don't push your faith in that sense, especially if you go into the sciences, it becomes weaker, in my opinion.
Interesting.
When you don't push your faith in that sense, because then you've learned to push science in that sense, and you see that you grow stronger in it, but you're not pushing your Christian faith in that sense, and you're not strengthening it in the same way. And so a lot of times what happens is you get pulled towards the sciences.
Yeah.
Because you start to see, oh, this makes sense, but this is not making sense, this is not making sense. And I'm not questioning it, why it's not making sense. But when you start to, pull back and question things, I think you'll become stronger.
That makes sense, because we made a video called, how to handle doubt on our YouTube channel. And I tell Christians like kind of the same thing that you did. If there's something that you are scared of, like one that I could think of off the top of my head, like, why does God allow bad things to happen? You can ignore that question and you can say like, no, well, God is God. And you just kind of shut your mind off to that. Those unanswered questions will weaken, like you said, your faith. But if you look at it at face value and say, okay, why does God? Okay, let's look at suffering.
Yeah.
Okay. And, I feel like one of the arguments that I have when it comes to why does God allow bad things to happen is, in order for bad things to be bad, there needs to be God. Because if we purely lived in a biological environment where we didn't have a soul and we were only animals, the only real law would be kind of survival of the fittest.
Yeah.
You can do whatever you want. And so if I flat out wanted to murder somebody, kind of like Adolf Hitler, he wanted to murder a bunch of people. He killed millions of people. According to a biological standpoint, what he did wasn't wrong, because he wanted to kill. Survival of the fittest. Yeah. He can do what he wants. And so part of me, I love that you said to confront those questions, to hold on to those questions, because it was through me looking at like, God, why do bad things happen? And the more I looked at it, I'm like, can bad things be bad if there is no God? So I think that is important. Yeah. I think you're completely right. To be able to look at something and say, why? Yeah. Because God is a complex God. He is an infinite God who is incredibly wise and smart. And like you said, this world is just us kind of, you do it with science. I feel like for me, I do it just with like the Bible and his truths. Like science belongs to God in the same sense. Like I'm getting ready to go to Japan and getting ready to try to start a church, and like church formation, like that belongs to God, and we try to observe things to see what works. Like, okay, maybe we should do this. And so I really appreciate that answer.
Yeah. I think that's what's gotten me to strengthen my faith. I think that's something that others who aspire to be Christian scientists should also, because in the science realm, you're asked to question things all the time. So why not apply it on the other end? Don't just ignore those questions. Yeah. You're going to create doubt in your mind and things like that. So I think at the end of the day, confront them.
So really fast, you mentioned going back to school. I know a little bit, but I would like to know a little bit more. Why are you going back to school? What are you studying? Like, what's your reason for that?
Okay. So I think my childhood goal was to always get a PhD. I think this is the time I feel like everything's falling into place.
Mm-hmm.
Might be a God-given thing that
Mhm.
everything's falling into place. Although my anxieties tell me no. But yes, so I'm going back for my master's,
Mm-hmm.
and that's really because I've been out of school for so long. I think it's been 8 years.
Mm-hmm.
So I need to get back into the academic realm.
Yeah.
But my ultimate goal is to get a PhD. And I think with the PhD, I do want to lead like a research group. So I'm seeing that now,
Mm-hmm.
what research looks like in my current job. And I kind of like that environment of, being on the frontier, right? Of discovering things and, the frontier of science, basically.
Yeah.
And, in order to get there is a PhD. And so I think that's the ultimate end goal.
Yeah. I feel like your path is very unique.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like, I know, being in your field, a lot of Christian scientists, but what is one thing or one person that like inspires you, motivates you? For me, I'm a writer. A lot of I write for our YouTube channel on Impact Video Ministries, and I've learned that I need to regularly be inspired, because I pour out, I write all these different scripts. I'm trying to write one on like what are angels. I'm trying to write another one on what is the book of life. And so there's all these different things. And so I regularly have to do things like right now my show is Bluey. I absolutely love Bluey. And it's just such innocent fun, you know, they're singing their songs and their mom and dad and everything. And like, it's adorable. Like, so that's a little embarrassing, but like, that's one thing that inspires me, just the simplicity of family, them enjoying each other's company and them raising up their kids. So for like you, what is something that motivates you, inspires you, helps you, recovers you, rejuvenates you as a person, as a scientist, as a Christian? What are those things that build you up?
I think the main motivator is the unknown. There's so much out there, adventures out there.
Up. Nice.
But no, I think in science, there's just so much to discover, right? And it doesn't matter what field you go into, there's always something to be learned. And I think that's a big motivator for me. And what's even more is kind of how can I connect that back to God, right? So the more we learn, I think, especially in the quantum realm, the more we learn in that, I think the more absurd it sounds. I think for me, it's exciting because it's like, well, is it because that's a space that God works in?
Yeah.
Right. And if we were to uncover that, is it easier for us then to kind of show God's hand in everything?
Yeah.
I think that for me is like the most exciting thing.
That's interesting. So as you were saying that, it made me think of like yesterday when I was teaching Romans, I was trying to encourage people to go to these different Bible studies. And whenever I teach young people, I'll always ask, like, raise your hand if you read the entire Bible. And most of them don't raise their hands. And there's 66 books in the Bible. And if you have not read every single book in the Bible, there is a side of God that you don't know.
Yeah.
Like, God is not just the God of Genesis, he is also the God of Malachi. He's also the God of Nahum. He's also the God of Titus. And so you have all of these different components of who God is. And I love you just looking into the unknown. Like, is God in this research?
Yeah.
Is God in this? Like, because you see water and you view water being like sinking. Like, you view that as not sinking. I'm sorry. You view that as a miracle. You view like, what is the slit theory?
The split experiment.
Yeah. Like, you see God in that and the duality of, the duality of light. You see that in the duality of man. And so your idea then is you love the unknown, especially when it comes to science, because you view that as another opportunity to possibly see God in that specific circumstance.
Yeah.
That's powerful.
That's my main motivator.
Nice. So final question.
Mhm.
Our podcast is called Practical Christianity.
Mhm.
And I find that the things that I love most in a Bible study is when it's practical.
Mhm.
Like when the pastor tells me, like, this is what you need to do. This is how you need to pray. This is how you need to read your Bible. This is the do. You know, when Jesus in Matthew chapter 7, he says, blessed is the man who hears my words and does them, for they are likened to a man who built his house on the rock, you know? So I know you had a word for aspiring Christian scientists, but for everybody else who's not a scientist, from your background, from your experience as a scientist and as a chemist, what are some practical things that you would tell them to do in their faith? What would you know, like the so what? Like, why should they care? Like, what would you tell them? Things to do in their faith to strengthen them. How can we make it practical for them?
I think creating the environment, right? So I think I was last week at church when we were talking about growth. This was about growth in family, but growth in a Christian family. And the pastor was talking about you need to create the environment for yourself, right? And that is, I guess for us would be a like mind, body, and soul, right? What should we do to create that? So I think for the mind is prayer for me, right? And I think it's really trying to tie everything back and giving back to God, your anxieties or everything, right? So that's for your mind, and creating that environment of prayer. For your body, that's I would say the external for me, and that's the people you are with, right? People who uplift you, and people who strengthen your faith. I think the Holy Spirit has to tell you and discern, the people around you. You'll get those feelings, right? And I think for the soul, that's the word, right? And just being in the word. And I think that's a complete environment for me for your spiritual growth.
The prayer, the Christian community, and the friends to build you up, and then God's word.
God's word.
For all three. And having a balance of that.
Yep.
I saw how you pray. Is there like the recipe for prayer? Do you have particular things that you do when it comes to your reading, and then also in terms of your community? Like, is there like what's the scientific method / the recipe for that and how you do it?
I think the reading one is probably easier, I guess. Only because I think I look at it analytically, right? So I usually go through, read a passage, and I think I try to look at each line and uncover what it's saying in the context of, the entire passage, right? And really delve into, well, what is it giving to me at this particular moment in my life, right? And I always try to do that because I believe that God's trying to show me something in the word for whatever specific reason in my life in this moment. And so I think that in that way, I can read the same passage a different day because I have something else going on that day.
Yeah.
And it would look completely different because all of a sudden I'm seeing it through a new lens from this day.
Yeah.
So I always try and look back on what has happened as I'm reading through, because it's going to show me something new. And then I relate that back into, kind of, okay, now that I have this information, what can I do myself given this knowledge? Right? I'm trying to keep it very general here.
Right. I feel like a lot of your life is just all about discovery.
Yeah.
Uncovering the unknown.
Yeah.
I like I don't know if I read like that, but that's cool. When you read, you look line by line and you're trying to think to yourself, what is God trying to tell me?
Mm-hmm.
You have this unknown God, unknown but known
Yeah.
God, unknown God that can be known. There we
Yes.
go. Unknown God that can be known. And you're just reading to just uncover his truths.
What he's
like
trying to tell me.
science.
Yeah. That's how I look at it. And I think I've learned so much from that, and like I said, I can read it, the same passage 2 weeks from now. And all of a sudden, because of what has happened in my life at that point, something new comes up,
Yeah.
and the passage is like, how come I didn't see that over here?
Yeah.
And I start to realize, oh yeah, I think in that sense, it's kind of like, that's when you get to know God. That's when he's kind of showing you the way. And that's why I relate at the end. Now I have all this information, or at least for this day.
Yeah.
Let's bookmark that somewhere, and I can use that, for another day. And then I can learn something else another day, and something else and something else. And so, you end up reading the Bible front to back,
There's always something to uncover.
Yep.
I love how you have just discovery in your reading the Bible, because, 2 Timothy 3:16, all scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness. Like, God tells us that scripture is useful for all these things. And you're just kind of having, it's useful, and you just want to uncover it, to reread it, and to package it. And I think I'm going to start applying that, honestly. Like, yeah, I know I should read, but your motive kind of tells me why I should read, because there is something that God is trying to communicate to me today.
Yeah.
And even if you read the same passage, because God being infinite in knowledge, and his word is good, there's a separate truth that can be given and uncovered as you continue to read. Okay. I think I'm going to apply that.
That's how I usually go into it. And I really enjoy from that perspective. I think that's probably because I enjoy uncovering things. Especially when I read, it's like, articles and things like that. Is for that reason.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, I'm learning something, and if you're stuck reading the Bible back, front to back all the time, you're like, what am I learning?
Yeah.
And I think I've learned that that's what you're learning. So for your soul, that's how you kind of feed your soul.
Yeah.
And in terms of community, that one's a little hard one, because it's kind of, you kind of have to have the discernment. And I think that comes from feeding yourself.
Yeah.
With the word, and you start to kind of understand, what God people look like, right? Like, you start to get attracted to that. And I think that came, when I was younger, when that family moved away, the Christian family moved away, and I went to the Mormon church, and the Jehovah's Witness. It's just like something didn't feel right. It's just that voice saying, like, these people believe in something, but it's not God.
Yeah.
I think that's what you need to listen to. Like, I think the Holy Spirit's always there to kind of tell you, something's not right here,
right?
And kind of go with it. 100% of the time, it's right.
Yeah.
And so that, I think for community, it's let God speak, through the Holy Spirit to you. You're gonna know, and you're not gonna, you're gonna know.
I think that's powerful that you say, kind of feel it out, coming as a scientist, because there are absolute truths, like reading God's word. You uncover it and you use that, and then you also have prayer, and you do that. And so you use both of these kind of constants that help you dive into something a little unknown, and you kind of also rely on feeling.
Yeah.
And I think it makes sense, because as you are going out and as you're discovering, and as you're looking at all these articles and challenging things to a degree, it's like I feel like it's also like a feeling.
Yeah.
It's like, I feel like it should be like this, but it's not like this. And so it looks like a lot of science is not just the things that you see, but also feelings.
Yeah.
And you use both.
I think having both is important, both in science and in the Christian faith. I think everything is both. You're right. You feel it. You're something doesn't feel right. But I think the logical part of it comes in when you start looking into it and delving into it and start applying logical things to it, and that's the thinking part. But I think more often than not, you have to feel it. And that's the environment, I think, that will help practically, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that kind of wraps everything up. Thanks a lot for this, Keo.
Oh, it was great being here.
This was a lot of fun. Man, okay. So I think you've changed my prayer life.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Thank you. I don't know. I think the venting helped me.
Yeah.
I like the vent because I apply the Thanksgiving too, like just thanking God for things on my walks. That's what I do. But I think I vent sometimes, but to have like a legitimate session where I'm just it helps give it back to God. I really like that. And then the discovery. I think that also really helped me, like figuring out what exactly God wants for me that day. Okay. Well, my hope for you as you kind of go into I remember you talking about your PhD, and now it's kind of coming to a point where you're going to get your master's, God willing, get your PhD, God willing, maybe even lead a research team, like you said. I really hope that in the same way that God always wants us to go deeper in our faith, I feel like there is, like for you, you're just kind of, in my life, you've always been one of the most knowledgeable people. And you kind of rest at the top, like, oh, hey, what do you think about this, Keo? I hope and pray that God brings you to a greater level of knowledge, to a greater level of awareness, of feeling, of just, I feel like there's just there's a next step for you. And there's a reason why you're going back to school. So I'm excited to see Dr. Keo. And maybe you can have another interview then.
Yeah, it's Dr. Keo.
And your research and everything.
Yeah, maybe once I finish like the PhD thesis, talk about that.
Yeah.
I mean, I think why, like I said, the forefront of chemistry is I think I really like the idea of discovering something and tying it to God.
Yeah.
Like, I think that's I can't explain in words how exciting that would be for me. I just picture in my mind doing research, getting stuck somewhere, and one day reading the Bible and just be like, here's the verse, just exactly like my professor taught.
Yeah.
It's right there. Or just be like, okay, here's a concept from the Bible. There's something related to that, in the physical world.
Yeah.
Let's look into it and then prove it. And just be like, this is, I mean, I hate to say that, that's, I want to prove that God exists, but it's more like for myself, the proof is in the pudding of, the Bible's there. It's always been there. The knowledge has always been there.
I love that when we're in a world that is trying to kick God out, you're a scientist that just naturally tries to insert God into what he researches and does. I think that is very powerful. And I think that just your way of looking at the world, just through the eyes and the lens of discovery, I think that alone is just something that is almost childlike, very innocent, just very like, wow, look at this crazy. We're like, as you're a little kid, just looking at everything and you're just amazed. And I just feel that in you. And I think it's very encouraging. Okay. So can I pray for you?
Yeah.
And let's wrap it up. Dear God, I thank you so much just for my friend Keo. And I thank you so much just the path that you've put him in when it comes to his whole schooling and just that family that moved close by to him and just kind of introducing him to you. And I thank you so much for this opportunity for him to go back to school. And I just pray that you would continue to lead him, and that you would lead him to make discoveries in your word and in science. And I pray that you would just bless his hands as he learns, as he works hard, as he thinks, as he vents, and the things that he does. I pray that you would bless him. So I thank you so much. Help him to pass, help him to do that thesis, help him with work. And I just pray that you would bless my friend immensely. So we thank you so much, God, just for this time. And I pray that for the people who are watching this, that you would encourage them. And then if they want to be scientists, I pray that they would question, and that they would look at the things they're questioning, and that they would do them. And for the people that are, that are like me and just aren't scientists, I pray that you would help us to learn to pray deeper and to read deeper. So we thank you, God, for this conversation. In your name we pray, Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Keo.